Welcome to Stewardology, a podcast where two worlds collide. In this show, financial advisor Tim Russell and Reverend Drew Gysi come together to explore the intersection of financial stewardship and theology. Their unique perspectives help Christians and churches understand and apply a biblical framework for everyday financial decisions, so Christians everywhere can improve and strengthen their walk with Christ through biblical stewardship. Before we get started, we just wanted you to know that the topics discussed in this podcast are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific investment advice or recommendations. Investing and investment strategies involve risk, including the potential loss of principal. Past performance is not a guarantee of future results. Securities and advisory services are offered through Genuous Wealth Management, member FINRA and SIPC. Without further ado, here are your hosts, Tim Russell and Drew Gysi.
Welcome to the Stewardology Podcast. My name is Tim Russell, and today our co-host Drew Gysi is not going to be joining us. He is actually, of all things, spending time with his family as his daughter graduates from school. I think she's getting a second master's degree today. So we can all congratulate Drew for this big milestone with his daughter. Today we have episode 91, where we have a very special episode. We will be interviewing Gysi Myhre from Eventide Asset Management. So we're going to be talking about investing that changes the world. That is our theme today, investing that changes the world. Before I get going and hand the mic over to Gysi and we interact on this topic, I would really like to set this up by thinking about a few passages of scripture before we get going. When God created the world, He gave us the creation mandate. It's often thought of as being found in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. In this passage, it says this, "And God blessed them, and God said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over it.'" Rather than teaching that Christians ought to in some way abuse or distort creation, mankind was actually given the role to be the caretaker, to be the tender of creation. We are to look after, to nurture, to care for the world in which God has planted us, in which He has set us as His agents, caring for the earth for Him. Now, after the fall, right? So you remember God created the world. Everything was perfect. The Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, everything was going perfectly well. And then enters sin. Mankind falls. And as a part of that fall, we read that there were implications of that on our role as the caretakers of creation. That whole process got more complicated because the fall and the curse impacted the earth. Read with me in Genesis chapter 3, verse 19. It says, He said, "Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, and for you are dust, and to dust you shall return." Boy, that's an encouraging verse, huh? Who has that one as their life verse? The reality is that sin impacts the world. And because of that, part of our role now is to work in this world with the sweat of our brow and the effort in our bodies to care for this world in such a way as to provide for our own needs, our own benefit, our own well-being, and that of our family, and frankly, to make the world a better place, to help the world rejoice. And that's kind of where Eventide comes in. Eventide is a Christian asset management firm, and we've invited them in today because we've talked in previous episodes about biblically responsible investing in such a way that's consistent with your worldview, consistent with the things that are important to you. And one of the things that I really appreciate about Eventide is the fact that they are unapologetic in their understanding that they, as a Christian investment manager, they have a mission, they have a calling to invest in the things and the kinds of companies and the kinds of products and services that are actually going to help alleviate pain and suffering, to help make the world a better place. So that's part of our goal today, to help you be introduced to the fact that investing has a powerful way to change the world. And to that end, we've invited Gysi Myhre, who is a founding member with the values-based investment company called Eventide. So he's got a robust educational background. He's biological engineering, actually, and he also holds an MS and a BS from the University of Florida. So with all of that being said, Gysi Myhre is a fellow brother in Christ. He's worked with Eventide for a number of years, and we're excited to have him join us. Before I pass the mic over to Gysi, I love, Gysi, want to share a few words about, a little bit about maybe your background, and just tell us a little color. Who is Gysi and what makes you tick?
Yeah.
What do you like to do on the weekends,
Well, it's great to be with you, and thanks for the opportunity. So I'm Jason, for those of you who are listening in, and I work with this company, Eventide. I'm one of the founding members, so I've been around Eventide for a long time. We got started in 2008. And really what makes me tick is seeing my work as really, you couldn't have set it up more beautifully with the cultural or creation mandate there in Genesis 1:26 through 28, is to see my work as in service of the King. And it is my belief that the realms of business and investing that I work in today rightly belong to God, and that there is a way that we can interact with business and investing that enhances God's reputation in the world and is a powerful witness to his kingship. And more than that, business and investing are meant to be our human creaturely ways by which we enlarge the beauty and goodness of the world that God made, going all the way back to the garden. So I could go on and on about this. I have a strong love for theology. I actually head up, in addition to my day-to-day work with Eventide Asset Management, I head up the Eventide Center for Faith and Investing, which is an educational initiative started by Eventide to help Christians understand God's purposes for investing and how to live those out in their life. So this is a subject that's very near and dear to my heart. And then one other thing I'll say about me is that outside my Eventide roles, I'm also a fellow of the Center for Faithful Business, housed at Seattle Pacific University, which is a Christian college in the Pacific Northwest.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. That's really fantastic. Well, with that in mind, now that we've been able to introduce you to Gysi, I'd like to hand over the mic to Gysi and allow him to share with us his presentation, The Power of Investing to Change the World. Now, this episode is going to include in our show notes a PDF document that will include all of the slides for the presentation. We're going to try to communicate the information in such a way as to, you can listen to this and still get a lot out of it. But I am confident that you will be benefited by actually seeing some of the things that we have, that Gysi has prepared for us in this PDF presentation. So it's free of charge. Go to the show notes, stewardologypodcast.com. You'll find the episode in there, and you can find all the download links right there in your on your website. All right, with that, Gysi, take it away.
Great. Well, yeah, I'm going to try to make this as intelligible without visual accompaniment as possible, but you will benefit if you can see some of the visuals. The topic, again, is the power that our investment choices have to shape the world around us. Whenever you're talking about changing the world, it's important that you have a working theory about how the world, in fact, changes. And I'd like to share with you some thoughts from a sociologist at the University of Virginia, a man by the name of James Davison Hunter, who's actually a Christian sociologist, and he heads up their Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture. I consider him to be one of the world experts on how the world changes. And he's actually written a fascinating book for popular audiences, written from a Christian perspective, entitled To Change the World. And so I'd recommend that to you. So I'll be drawing on his theory of change here. And in his book, he argues that here, at least in America, we tend to put too much world-changing confidence in politicians and individuals working alone. Okay, so think about politicians for a moment. They do play a role in changing the world around us, but politicians here in America are democratically elected, so they're elected by popular vote, more or less, and they're hired to enact ideas that have already been embraced by the population. So in a sense, they're not so much revolutionaries as much as they are go with the flow. They have to be reading the winds of society. They have to operate in harmony with those winds. And so they're really downstream of a lot of culture-changing thought and ideas. They're really more servants to the will of the people. They play their part, no doubt, but he says in general, we overemphasize the role of politics. Secondly, he says we overemphasize individuals. Now, what does he mean here? We all have heroes from history. And I was just speaking at a conference this weekend called the Wilberforce Conference. And so maybe Wilberforce is your hero from history. You know, history remembers individuals, but individuals were never alone. If you read the biographies, you realize this. And Wilberforce, for example, had a whole group around him called the Clapham Circle, which had elite members of society from every domain, business and poets and philosophers and you name it, that all worked alongside of him to accomplish that abolitionist movement. And so individuals never work alone. Now, what does Hunter say does change the world then? Here's what he says. And this is a quote from him. He says, the capacity to change the world is not evenly distributed in a society, but is concentrated in certain institutions, keyword, institutions, and among certain leadership groups who have a lopsided access to the means of cultural production. So very fancy way of saying that there are these elite institutions that hold a disproportionate amount of power in shaping our world. And if you think about institutions for a moment, you know, for example, you could think about the institutions of higher education, how I'm calling you from Louisville, Kentucky, and we have the University of Louisville. Some cultural power, but then compare that to a Harvard University, right? We get that there are certain institutions of power. Or you can think about media. My newspaper is the Courier Journal. Compare that to the New York Times. There are these institutions of power. And what I'd like to do is to kind of walk you through investing as an institution of power and to show you this power in history. And then we can talk about how to responsibly and faithfully use that power with our investment choices today. So hopefully that sounds good. I'm gonna kick it off with a familiar example. So all of us from middle school history remember Christopher Columbus, who set sail on one of the most famous voyages of all time. We all know the story, right? He sailed the ocean blue in 1492. But what a lot of us don't know about the story of Columbus is actually the investing side of that journey. So the best way to think about Columbus is to think about Columbus as an entrepreneur who was starting a for-profit shipping business. He wanted to establish a more profitable shipping business to access goods from India, things like spices. So he was from Italy. And the way that you would get from Italy to India in his day was you would go by ship and you would sail around the Horn of Africa. Well, he had the novel idea that instead of sailing around Africa, perhaps he could sail west across the Atlantic and reach India in a more expeditious manner. There were many people in his day, including Columbus, who believed that Japan was just 2,600 miles west of Europe. Now, obviously, that's dead wrong, but that's what people believed. And there were some reasons for that. There were Chinese artifacts that had washed up on the shore of Europe, leading people to do some calculations and work it out that it was about 2,600 miles away. Well, He wanted to go and establish a business that would do that would sail west, get to India quicker, and be a more profitable business. And he was going to be the one to do it. So risky proposition, right? He could sail off into the sunset, never to return. Very expensive. This was a staggering amount of money that he needed for this business in that day. And this was before the stock and the bond. And the way that you would go and get capital for a large scale enterprise is you had to go and basically beg for it from kings and queens. So Columbus had to traipse all over Europe trying to get investors. And he was doing it by meeting with kings and queens. He started in Italy, where he was from, and was turned down. He went to France and was turned down. He went to England and was turned down. He went to Spain and was turned down. But he was a very persistent man, and he had actually a spiritual advisor that said that God had called him to this work. And so he went back to Spain and made his case and ultimately won their favor. And then maybe you remember the story of Ferdinand and Isabella there. So ultimately, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella backed Columbus, gave him the capital, and he set sail. We all know what happened. He did not find Japan. He basically happened upon Central America, and the rest is history. Now, think about this power of investing for a moment. What would have happened had Columbus not been so persistent? What would have happened had no one said yes to his investment? I mean, what would human history look like? But even the way that it went, we often don't think about the world-changing consequence of investment. So let me give you some thought-provoking questions here. Have you ever wondered why Central America speaks Spanish, or why the major religion of that whole territory is Roman Catholic, or why, as a part of their diet, they eat tortillas, things like that? The answer to these questions is actually investors. So because Spain backed Columbus, he sailed under the Spanish flag, not the Italian flag, although he was Italian. And as a result, he carried Spanish interests with him into the territory that he discovered. This is what determined the language, Spanish, after Spain. The religion, Roman Catholic. Spain is Roman Catholic. Things like tortillas, where did that come from? Spain. And so we can see that there are many, many dramatic cultural and social consequences to just the movement of capital and the backing of businesses. Now, if this seems like a strange way to think about investing, I want to give you another example just to provoke your thought. So a couple more shipping businesses. So economic historians tell us that the world of investing was born out of the shipping industry. We just talked about Columbus in the 1400s. This continued in the 1500s, and investing was really, really born out of the 1600s with a couple of big companies, the British India Company and the Dutch East India Company. Again, shipping businesses just like Columbus. These were businesses, again, that were established to establish trade with India and the Dutch East Indies. So what made these companies unique, though, as opposed to Columbus, is that they mark the beginning of the modern corporation and the beginning of the modern investing era. Now, what made them modern? Well, they got all of the capital that they needed to start their businesses, not by going to kings and queens as Columbus had done, but by taking advantage of a new financial invention called the stock and the bond. This is the very first time this had ever been done. It was something of a financial experiment. So instead of going to kings and queens, they broke up the risk and the capital requirements into these little tiny pieces, put them in stocks and bonds, and raised that capital with ordinary investors. In fact, we get the world's first stock exchange, which was established in Amsterdam, where people could trade these shares with one another on a secondary market and to get liquidity. Now, did these two companies change the world? Oh, man, just profoundly. So in the case of the British India Company, consider this. The company was so successful and powerful that India becomes a colony of Britain. Isn't that amazing? And this is why, to this day, although not a lot of people know this, the official language of India is, drumroll, it is actually English. You can look that up. They have the second largest English-speaking population in the world. And if you count those who speak English as a second language, they're number one in the world for speaking English, India. How'd that happen? The British India Company and the investors who backed it. And if you know anything about Indian history, from the arts to the railroad to their political structures, and in so many other ways, it is all intertwined with British culture as a result of this one powerful company. Now, what about the Dutch East India Company? Well, they got started in 1602, and by the year 1634, they had grown in size to be valued as a company in today's dollars at $8.2 trillion. That's with a capital T. But you may say, wow, that's a lot of money. Yes, it is. How does that compare to big companies today? Well, the stock market has been trading places with some of the big companies, but Apple, for example, is valued at approximately $2 trillion. It's one of the biggest companies in the world. And this company was 4 times the size of Apple at $8.2 trillion. This is actually the answer to the trivia question, what is the largest company that has ever existed? It is the Dutch East India Company. And do you think that a company 4 times the size of Apple, concentrated in Southeast Asia, had an impact on the culture there? I mean, just profoundly. So we don't often think about these things. And, in the investors who bought these stocks and bonds, we could ask, were they trying to change the world? I don't think so. I think they were probably trying to change their financial situation, right? But investing has this power, is what I want to point out. Now, the world of investing is often running by this point in the 1600s. And one of the people that commented on it was actually someone you may recognize, a person named Daniel Defoe, who wrote Robinson Crusoe, if you've ever had to read that book. And he basically talked about how the investing situation was messy. I want to read you a passage from him on this point. He says, investing has raised the fancies of credulous people to such a height that merely on the shadow of expectation, they formed companies, chose committees, appointed officers, shares in books, raised great stocks, and cried up an empty notion to that degree that people have been betrayed to part with their money for shares in a new nothing. That was not Shakespeare. That was actually Daniel Defoe. It's incredibly dense language. But what he's saying is that the opportunity to get capital that is now possible because of the invention of the stock and the bond meant an explosion of businesses. A wonderful thing. This is actually one of those cultural developments in history that I think was a tremendous innovation for business and economics. But what happened is now lots of people could get capital because they didn't have to go to kings and queens. And so you got entrepreneurs coming out of the woodwork, including many entrepreneurs who have no business starting businesses, right? They don't have any good ideas. They're not really wired to be entrepreneurs. And so they're going around and he says, crying up an empty notion. Basically, they're talking up their prospective businesses, and they're getting people to buy their stocks and their bonds and give them all this capital. And he goes on to say in this quote, which you'll find in the slides if you pull those up, that this led to a lot of businesses folding up and people losing a bunch of money. So it was messy at the start. There was one other thing that was going on, and it has to do with the investors. So the investors weren't just being duped. They were also not paying attention. So they saw the wild fortunes that were made by the investors in those first couple of experimental stock and bond businesses, the British India Company and the Dutch East India Company, and they wanted in on the action. They too wanted to get rich. And so they start snatching up every kind of stock and bond that gets issued with a kind of frenzied excitement. And they start to not pay attention to really what they're supporting and really what these businesses are and how congruent those businesses are or were with their worldview, with their vision for the world and their ethical commitments.
Jason, this sounds like the first stock bubble. Is that right?
Yeah. I actually, when I talk about this example, I think that it's very similar. If you want an analogy to today, I think it's very similar with the excitement that people often have around digital currencies or cryptocurrencies. It's not that there isn't promise in those technologies in the same way that these original stocks and bonds held tremendous promise for businesses and for the world. It's just that people didn't really think very carefully about what they were stepping into, and were just so caught up in the excitement of the whole thing. And so we have to be, we have to see here that this was both good and bad. The bad was that people began to focus on the profit-making potential and not really on what they were supporting. Now, there was actually a hero in church history who was observing this and was deeply bothered by it, and that was a man named John Wesley, a name that should be familiar if you're a Christian listening in. He's a hero in church history. He founded the Methodists. This is still a denomination of Christianity to this day. He was an English minister in the 1700s. And just to give you a sense for who he was, this is probably his most famous quote. He said, "Do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as you ever can." I love that quote. So Wesley wanted to do all the good he could by speaking into this nascent movement of investing and to really help connect people back with an ethical vision and a discernment about how they're shaping the world. Now, how would a pastor do this? He would do it the way that he knew how, which was by preaching a sermon, which is what he did. He preached a sermon in 1759 under the title, very humble title, "The Use of Money." And this is actually a really important milestone in investing history. In fact, secular historians agree that the entire responsible investing movement, or whatever term you want to use there, values-based, sustainable investing, ESG, faith-based, et cetera, it all began with this sermon. So I want to share with you his thought process and what he told his congregation in this sermon from 1759. He had 3 points to his sermon, and the investing point was point number 3. He said, "We are thirdly to gain all we can." So pause. First, notice he was not opposed to making money. He said, "Gain all we can." Continuing on, "but without hurting our neighbor." Interesting comment. He said, "This we cannot do if we love our neighbor as ourselves." Now, where do we love your neighbor as yourself? Where is that coming from? That's the second greatest commandment, according to Jesus, to love your neighbor as yourself, right behind loving the Lord your God. He says, we cannot, if we love everyone as ourselves, hurt anyone in his substance. So what Wesley was pointing out is that investing actually has 2 sides to it. There's the side we're familiar with, which is the potential to receive profits. And that's valid. And he says, hey, you should try to get as good a gain as you can. But there's another side. Where is that money coming from? That money is coming from real companies that are having a real impact in the lives of others, our neighbors, and indeed the world. And he says both sides are important. In fact, it's important that our gains come from companies that are a blessing to their neighbors and the world. In fact, he goes on to say this quite explicitly. He lays down a principle which I think echoes in history. It is as relevant today as the day he spoke it. And may we all be able to have something like this live beyond us. He said, and I'm going to expound on him just a bit for clarity. He said, if the profits we earn come from business activities that profit or benefit the souls of men, you're clear. Your employment is good. Your gain is innocent. When the profits come from business activities that profit others, that is a good profit. But he says, if the profits come from business activities that are sinful in themselves or natural endless to sin of various kinds that fail that neighbor test, then it is to be feared. You have a sad account to make. And lest we think he's mincing words, he says, oh, beware lest God say in that day, meaning the final day, the day where we will have to give an account for our lives, these have perished in their iniquity, but their blood do I require at thy hands. Wow. I mean, just shocking language. You know, working in the investment industry, it's common to hear about the risks of investing. And what are those? You can lose your money. But what is John Wesley saying? He's saying you can lose your soul as a result of the investment choices that you make. And why is this?
That's powerful.
Yeah, it is powerful. And I think there's something that's so true about what he's saying. When you invest, you're not investing in a chart. You're not investing in the stock market as some abstract financial concept. You're not investing in financial machinery. you are investing in real businesses that are having a real impact in the lives of others. And our investment makes us participants in whatever it is that company is doing. And so he's saying, hey, we have to be attentive to the world shaping consequences of our choices. These impact our neighbors and our witness to the Lord. So really good stuff, I think, from Wesley. And this helps to shed light on how we view business today. You know, we could talk about big businesses today. You can think of any of the big companies, Google, Facebook, Twitter, Netflix. We look at these companies and we marvel at how successful they've become. And now, hopefully, I've illustrated for you the role that investing plays. These companies exist only because of investors. They succeed only because of investment. So there's a powerful responsibility that comes from making these investment choices. We're not just kind of a financial leech on successful businesses. We're actually enabling business to succeed. That's the role that investment capital provides. All right, let me give you one last historical example, and this one is really, I think, just a shining example for Christians, and it comes from 1971, so not too long ago, a little before my time, but thankfully we have history books, and I've read up on this. So 1971, there was something happening in South Africa called apartheid. Now, this can be a little bit of a fuzzy history for some folks, so I want to just explain what apartheid was. The word apartheid comes from a language in South Africa, from the Afrikaans, and the word means separation. In fact, you can translate apartheid literally as aparthood, or to keep separate. And it described an institutionalized racial segregation that existed in South Africa in that day, where the black population was kept separate from the white population and was treated in a very inferior manner. It was analogous to Jim Crow segregation in the U.S., but worse. And the year was 1971. So this is right after the Civil Rights Movement. And so a lot of people in the U.S. are looking at this from afar, dismayed and disturbed, including Christians, as you'll see. Now, South Africa was really not budging on this issue. So the South African government, they were enduring lots of sanctions from the United Nations and embargoes, and they were just ignoring it. They were not interested in changing their ways. So, ask yourself, let's say you're an American Christian in 1971 looking from afar, and you have a heart for providing equal treatment for blacks and whites in South Africa. How would you go about changing the situation? Well, the Episcopal Church got creative. So the Episcopal Church began looking at their investments, and they realized that they were investing in General Motors, one of the biggest companies of the day. And General Motors actually had operations in South Africa. So these Episcopals, they put two and two together, and they said, wait a minute, we don't want to be entangled here. But on the other hand, we have a voice into this company because don't we own the company? And so what they decided to do is to write a letter as shareholders of the company and express their displeasure, and also to kind of state how their displeasure could be satisfied. Now, you may hear this and think, well, don't lots of investors do this today? Well, now they do. But this was the very first time in history this had ever been done. This was completely novel. And to write this letter, they enlisted the help of a man named Leon Sullivan, who was a black man and a Baptist minister from Philadelphia. And he wanted to see this apartheid situation change. And so together with the Episcopals, they came up with a set of principles for GM that they called the Sullivan Principles, after this Baptist minister, Leon Sullivan. It was things like equal pay for equal work, same working conditions for blacks and whites, integrating their bathrooms and water fountains, which were segregated, things like that. So they put these principles into the letter. They mail it off to GM, probably with a prayer. But GM decides to adopt these principles. And they even bring Leon Sullivan, this lowly Baptist minister, onto the board of General Motors, one of the most powerful companies in the world, to help give them guidance. Shortly after that, Ford and Goodyear, two other automotive companies that had operations in South Africa as well, they adopted the principles. And what you began to see is this cascading effect, like dominoes, of companies adopting these principles despite the outstanding apartheid structures around them. And so apartheid began to break from the inside of business as a result of the faithfulness of a small group of Christians. Now, you may be interested to know how much financial interest did these Christians have in General Motors such that they could write such a bold letter? Well, get this. They owned 0.006% of the outstanding shares. This was not some financial takeover or activist investing. This was faithfulness, and God blessed it. And it changed the lives of millions and millions of Blacks in South Africa for the better. So I think just an incredible situation of the way in which faithfulness in investing has world-changing consequence. Now, if I've tantalized you with this suggestion, the obvious question is, well, what do we do with this? How do we harness this? And to succeed, a few things are required. So first of all, you have to be intentional. If you simply own the market or invest in just a traditional investment product, you are using the power of investing, but you're using it in an indiscriminate way. You're essentially just capitalizing the status quo. So if you want to see the world look different in any way, well, you're going to have to be intentional with how you invest that capital. That should be obvious. Second, we have to work together. This is way bigger than my IRA or your 401k or 403b or whatever you're investing in. We have to work collaboratively. There's a lot of money in the world moving around, and so we have to think together about this. And finally, we need tools. We need ways to engage the common good. So I consider the company I work for, Eventide, to be one of these tools by providing investment funds guided by a biblical world and life view. I consider podcasts like these to be a tool for getting the word out and getting people to consider what's happening behind the account statements and how to be more intentional there. So lots of tools have to come together. Now, how can you be intentional? There's really three ways. So the first way you can be intentional is to choose to avoid investing in companies that have problems. This is the essence of what John Wesley talked about in that sermon, choosing to avoid investing in companies that harm our neighbor, that harm creation, that bring dishonor to God. And this is a pretty well-described practice in our industry. In the Christian space, this goes by the term biblically responsible investing, where you can choose to avoid investing in companies connected to abortion, tobacco, pornography, gambling. There's a set of issues there. And as Christians, I think, given the choice, we would say, yeah, I wouldn't want to be a part of that. So that's one way you can be intentional, is by avoiding things. Second, you can also embrace things. As I said in the beginning of this presentation before I got going, business and investing belong to God. They are ways by which we may fulfill that original creative calling to actually develop creation in ways that bring God glory. I think business and investing, just as human cultural activities, are things we can embrace and actually really get involved in. And so we should be thinking, as Adam was an under ruler serving over God's good creation, we can actually think about ourselves as ruling over creation in the way we make investment choices, by strategically allocating capital toward businesses doing beautiful and good things in the world in line with God's purposes in creation. And finally, you can engage companies just like the Episcopals did. I think what I'll do here is I want to give you just a couple of examples of what it would mean to embrace this embrace dimension. What would it mean to invest in things that are bringing about beauty and goodness into the world? In the slide handouts that you have there on the podcast show notes, I give three examples. I'm going to give you two here just in the interest of time. There's a third if you want to check it out. I want to talk about something called water technology. So just what is the state of water in our world today? More than 2,000 children die every day from water-related illnesses. This is something you almost never hear about, but it's a huge problem nonetheless. Let me give you some stats on this. So about 1 million people die each year from diarrhea due to water-related illnesses, and 80% of those 1 million deaths are children under the age of 5. Dirty water is, right now as we record this podcast, the second largest killer of children in the world, behind pneumonia.
Wow.
Yeah, it's incredible. By the year 2025, that's in 3 short years, 800 million people will not have access to drinking water, according to experts. 800 million. 133 million people have to live with worms in their stomach due to contaminated water. 1/2 of the schools of the world do not have access to clean water. My colleague, Fenny, who's our co-chief investment officer, he goes to Uganda each year for church reasons. And before becoming an investor, he was a medical doctor. And so while he's there, he conducts a medical clinic that's called a deworming clinic. So basically everyone that lives in Uganda and of course, huge swaths of Africa have a critter living in their stomach called Bilharzia, which is a worm, and you get it from drinking contaminated water.
There's a picture in the show notes. You may or may not want to check it out.
It's a pretty gross looking worm. Yeah, I will admit. It's a treatable thing. In fact, it's not very difficult to treat, which is, of course, why he does this clinic. But if you think about it, this is just temporary relief, because these people show up to this clinic, they get dewormed. He sends them home where they drink contaminated water, which is where they got the worm. So we have to really be thinking not just about relief, but striking at root causes. And the root cause is people don't have clean water to drink. In most of the world, water is considered women's work. And the reason that this is important is that water is one of the main reasons why women lag behind men in educational standards globally. Why is that? Because women have a full-time job in most of the world, and that is getting water for the family. The lot falls to them. And so if you have a family and you have a son and a daughter, the daughter has a job. She gets water for the family. The son gets to go to school. And this just propagates. And so this is one of the reasons why women's educational standards fall behind, which is so heartbreaking, right? Because, those young girls, they want to learn about the amazing creation that they live in, and they have to hear about it secondhand from their brothers. And there's much lost in translation there. By the way, this is also the reason why teenage pregnancy rates are so high in the developing world. It's because women have to walk, these girls have to walk a long distance to get water, and predators hide out along the path. And this leads to lots of pregnancies. I'll let you fill in the details there. Parts of the world are absolutely reaching crisis levels. I've got a picture in the slides of a well in Gujarat, India, a very arid climate, where you'll see a sea of humanity surrounding a small well where not much water is available. And so fights break out over water frequently. Here's a quote from one of the women. "We face acute shortages of water, but water is available only 2 to 3 hours a day. Frequent fights. Need to walk 20 to 30 minutes to fetch water. It is so humiliating." So humiliating. It's heartbreaking. But, the problem is actually not for lack of water in the world. It is for lack of access. So as you think about where the world's water is, most of it is in the ocean, 96.5%. So it's salt water. That leaves a little sliver of fresh water. And if you look into that fresh water, most of that fresh water is in glaciers and ice caps where it's frozen and cannot be accessed or would be very difficult to access. Almost all the rest is underground. Then finally you get down to surface water, a very, very tiny percentage, and you have to get past ice and snow before you finally get to things like rivers and lakes. If you see this, I've got a chart on this, you realize that surface water, things like rivers and lakes, they're actually not capable of sustaining the population. And you may think that is a very unchristian comment to make. Didn't God create an abundant world? Well, he did, but he crowned us with cultivating power. We're supposed to develop God's good creation. And so I think we can see that just built into the order of creation, God has actually hidden water under the ground that human cultivation is supposed to develop and bring forth. This is one of the ways we bring God glory and reveal his glory in creation. And so by accessing that groundwater, we could address this problem. In fact, experts in the world of water say that we could fix the problem in 1 year. Interestingly, what they say is needed: business and investment. So we wanted to be a part of this solution at my company. And so we invested in one of the leaders in water technology in the world that's actually the leader in the developing world, where 25% of their business comes from. And I want to read you just one of the business goals that this publicly traded company has. Very unusual. They have a 2025 goal to provide clean water for at least 20 million people living at the base of the global economic pyramid. Translation: the poorest of the poor. Imagine that. This is just a secular business that has set as their mission: we want to provide clean water to 20 million people who are the poorest of the poor. I think just an incredible goal to have. And I think this really highlights what business's true calling is. Business is called to provide goods and services that meet human needs and bring glory and honor to God. And I think this is just an exciting thing to be a part of as an investment idea. Let me give you one last example, and then I'll conclude my comments. So this is an example from the world of healthcare and unmet needs there, particularly in the area of our central nervous system. So I want you to think for a moment about the disease schizophrenia, and just jog your mind and say, what do I know about that disease? A lot of people struggle to define it. They've heard of it, of course, but they struggle to define it. Sometimes it's misdefined as split personalities. That's actually a totally separate disease. So what is schizophrenia? It's a set of symptoms. And this is why people can't come up with the definition, because they can't remember all the symptoms. The big symptoms are delusions and hallucinations. So people report that they see things and they hear things that are actually not there. It actually can seem almost like a demonic disease, because often what they report they see and hear is very dark in nature, encouraging them to hurt themselves or to hurt others. It preys on lots of darker pathways within the mind. People with schizophrenia will have disorganized speech, so it'll be hard to understand them. They'll have what's called a flat affect, so their emotional range is compressed. They won't speak as much. They lack initiative. They just can't get motivated. I'll often ask audiences whenever I'm discussing this example, I'll say, hey, have you ever met anybody that has schizophrenia? And people kind of scratch their beards and think for a moment. And they'll say, I might have known somebody whose daughter had it, and it was really sad. And we miss the problem hiding in plain sight. Schizophrenia is a vast, vast problem among the homeless today. It's one of the main drivers, in fact, for homelessness. And thinking about those symptoms, it's easy to see why. I mean, how difficult it would be to hold down a job, or to bring your best self to work, or to develop a rich social network that supports your life like we all enjoy. It's a disease that leaves you oftentimes alone and without a home in the world. It affects a lot of Americans, about 3 million, which is approaching 1% of the population. The treatments we have are ancient and as a result, horrible. The last FDA-approved treatment for schizophrenia was the year 1952, if you can believe it. In medical years, that is it's like leeches and cutting. The World Health Organization ranks it as the third most debilitating disease in the world. The world is not short on problems and opportunities for business and investing. So we do a lot of healthcare investing at my company. We've watched the schizophrenia space for a long time, looking for some kind of hope or promise to come along. Eventually, a company came along that really had a promising treatment as we heard them out and looked at their research. And I'm not going to get into exactly how the medicine works in the body, but they had developed a treatment. We liked it. We decided to invest. And I want to share with you just the results of their clinical trial. So what they did is they took a group of people that had schizophrenia, and they divided them up into two equal groups. One of those groups got a placebo or a blank pill. It's the control group. They got nothing, basically. The other group got this drug that they had been working on. And this was a very carefully done study. Patients didn't know what they got. Doctors didn't know what they got. They admitted everybody to the hospital for 5 weeks, and then they monitored those symptoms that I described. And what they discovered over the 5 weeks is that the placebo group saw a reduction in their symptoms of about 5 points on this numerical scale. So people who got nothing got a little bit better. And that may seem weird, but it was actually totally expected. And the reason there is because it's a debilitating disease. So if you're just in a hospital where you're getting regular care from nurses and regular meals and attention, your life can improve marginally. And that followed normal patterns for schizophrenia care in other areas. But with the drug they had developed, those patients saw an almost 20-point reduction in this symptoms score, which clinicians told us would completely transform a person's life. So this was really, really exciting for us. Now, this was a phase 2 trial. So phase 3 is required before it could be approved for the population by the FDA. But based on the strength of this trial, we're very optimistic. We're investors here, so we're hoping for a good financial result. But I share it with you not for its profit-making potential, but for its world-changing potential. And hopefully you're beginning to see this. At my company, we have set as our tagline, something I'm very proud of, which I would encourage you to just embrace in your own life. It is investing that makes the world rejoice. I would argue that is the true calling of investing under God, investing that makes the world rejoice, investing in things that God himself could rejoice in. If you read Psalm 104, for example, it actually describes God being able to rejoice in the work and culture that humanity produces. And that happens, of course, when we conform to his purposes and to his design. And I think the examples I've given you are examples that fit with that original intent. I'll just leave you with one quote for the road here. This is from that sociologist that I talked about earlier, James Hunter, who says, most of us are inclined to what's been called the great man or the great person view of history, that the history of the world is but the biography of great men. The only problem with this perspective is that it's mostly wrong, he says. Against this great man view of history and culture, I would argue, this is Hunter speaking, along with many others, that the key actor in history is not the individual genius, but rather the network. If you're a person like me, you're not an individual genius. You're not a hero from history. You're somewhat ordinary. But the good news is that he says history doesn't turn on geniuses and heroes. It turns on ordinary people working together in a network, which is why I love sharing these stories with audiences, like on podcasts, is because I have a vision that, man, what would happen if a group of us caught hold of the true purpose of business and investment and strategically aligned our decisions with that design? I think it could change the world.
Jason, thank you for sharing that with us today. So what you've heard so far is that your choices, how you invest money, it is not a neutral thing. That you and I, as we engage in the activity of investing, actually have a God-given opportunity of actually doing good in the world, not just in profiting and making money, which, Lord willing, that's part of what we're doing. That's what we're trying to do with investing. But in doing so, we can help the world rejoice. We can help alleviate suffering. We can help things like the schizophrenia or water become more abundant and schizophrenia less destructive. Man, what kind of world would that be when we didn't have to see a huge percentage, 50% of the schools in the world without access to clean water. That's staggering. That being said, we want to close out our time today and just, think about this. Think about what you're doing on the investing world. Some of you maybe are in the early stages of investing. That's fine. I understand. Some of you may have been investing for many years, and now you're thinking about, what can I do with my investments to actually do good and to do well? Consider looking at your investing from a biblical worldview and using things that will actually indeed do good and accomplish the purpose for which God has placed you and me here in this world to accomplish. Well, brothers and sisters, if you have any questions for us, you can always reach out to us on our podcast website, stewardologypodcast.com. If you have any feedback or something that you found particularly helpful about this or a previous episode, that'll be another great way of sharing it. And another thing you can do is to leave for us a review and share in that review on your favorite podcast catcher what has been most helpful to you. What are the ideas, the concepts, or the episodes that have most impacted your thinking with regard to investing or with regard to stewardship? And for all of the show notes, and especially to see the show notes for this episode, make sure you go to our website, stewardologypodcast.com. Check on that website, or check on the show notes for this episode. That's episode 91, and you will find the accompanying slides for today's presentation. All right, brothers and sisters, thank you so much. Take care. God bless. And don't forget to invest in a way that makes the world rejoice.
Thank you for joining us on the Stewardology Podcast, where financial stewardship and theology meet. We'd like to help you take your next steps in biblical financial stewardship. First, subscribe in your podcast provider to get the newest episode delivered to you every week. Next, follow us on social media. And visit our website at stewardologypodcast.com. There you can find our social media links and our entire episode archive. Remember, some trust in chariots and some trust in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. See you next week on the Stewardology Podcast. Securities and advisory services offered through Genios Wealth Management, member FINRA and SIPC.